It was supposed to be just another day. A mother running errands, going about her business, never expecting that one simple traffic stop would turn into a moment that shook the system. But sometimes, life has a way of flipping the script, especially when the person being underestimated has more power than anyone realizes. This story begins with a routine patrol in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A police officer, trained to spot anything that seemed out of place, noticed a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury SUV. Maybe it was the car, maybe it was the neighborhood, or maybe it was just his own assumptions. But something made him decide to pull her over. At first, it seemed like just another stop. A request for license and registration, a few routine questions. But then things started to escalate. The woman, calm but firm, questioned why she was being detained. Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew her rights, someone who wasn't about to be bullied. But the officer wasn't listening. Whether it was impatience, bias, or a need to assert control, he made a decision, one that would soon come back to haunt him. Handcuffs. An unnecessary search. A public humiliation for a woman who had done nothing wrong. The officer thought he had the upper hand. He had no idea who he was dealing with, because what he didn't know was that this woman wasn't just anyone. She was the mother of one of the most powerful men in the country. A call was made, a name was dropped, and in an instant, everything changed. The officer's confidence cracked as the weight of his mistake became clear. But by then, it was already too late. The wheels of karma had already started turning, and the consequences were coming fast. What happened next left everyone, especially the officer, in complete shock. And trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one ends. The officer stood there, his stance firm, his grip tightening around the handcuffs. He thought he was in control. To him, this was just another routine stop, another person who needed to be put in their place. But the woman he had just detained wasn't flustered. She wasn't shouting, wasn't panicking, she was waiting, because she knew something he didn't. A few minutes passed, the tension thick in the air. Onlookers had started to gather, some recording on their phones, murmuring among themselves. The officer, still unaware of what he had just set in motion, continued his questioning, his tone dismissive. He asked where she was going, why she was in the area, throwing in questions that had nothing to do with a simple traffic stop. The woman remained calm. She had dealt with situations like this before, people making assumptions, people thinking they had power over her. But this time, the stakes were different. Then, the moment came. The woman, now tired of the back and forth, finally spoke up. Her voice was steady but carried weight. She told the officer her full name. It didn't click at first. He scoffed, acting unimpressed. But when she calmly told him to check his system, when she told him exactly who she was connected to, that's when everything changed. The radio crackled. The officer's expression shifted, his confidence faltering for the first time. He hesitated, glancing at his partner, then back at the woman in front of him. His fingers hovered over the radio, as if debating his next move. The silence stretched. Then he finally reached for his radio and called it in. A few moments later, a voice came through, urgent, serious. The officer's face paled. It was the kind of name that carried weight, the kind of connection that didn't just open doors, it could close them too. And suddenly, the officer realized that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his career. But what happened next? That was something even he wasn't prepared for. The officer's hand hovered over his holster, his confidence cracking as the voice on the radio delivered a message that made his stomach drop. He glanced at the woman he had detained, his mind racing. This wasn't just another driver who could be intimidated into submission. This was someone with real power, someone whose name carried weight in places he had no business crossing. His partner, standing just a few steps away, shifted uncomfortably. "What do they say?" he muttered under his breath. The officer didn't answer right away. He was too busy thinking, trying to figure out how to backpedal, how to undo what had already been done. But the damage was setting in, and it was setting in fast. Dr. Taylor didn't waste another second. He turned back to the patient, checking their pulse, adjusting the oxygen mask. He was running out of time, and every unnecessary delay could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay with me," he murmured to the patient, his fingers tightening around their wrist. He could feel how weak their pulse was, too weak. Bradley swallowed hard. Who is this?" His voice was hoarse, almost afraid of the answer. Dr. Taylor shot him a sharp look. "You don't even know. You just attacked me without thinking, and now you want details." His voice was low, controlled, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "Step aside. I don't have time for your second thoughts." The patient stirred slightly, their eyes fluttering open just enough to meet Bradley's. A flicker of recognition passed between them, and whatever breath he had left caught in his throat. His world tilted. His face paled even further, and for a moment he felt weightless, like the ground beneath him had disappeared. Memories rushed in, uninvited and unstoppable. This wasn't just anyone. This wasn't some random person being transported to the hospital. This was personal. The paramedic, growing impatient, revved the engine. "Last warning, officer. Either let us go or ride with us and explain yourself at the hospital." Bradley's jaw clenched. Every instinct told him to stop interfering, to let them go, but his pride, his past, held him in place. He hesitated, but before he could finish, a faint, rasping voice interrupted him. "Bradley." It was the patient, speaking his name. The sound shattered whatever illusion he had left that this was just another call. Dr. Taylor's gaze darted between the two, his frustration momentarily replaced by curiosity. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice still sharp but edged with something else now. Suspicion. Bradley took a shaky step back, his chest tightening. He wanted to deny it, to act like this didn't mean anything, but the truth was staring him in the face. And no matter what he did next, there was no escaping it. The sound of his name coming from the patient's lips sent a chill down Bradley's spine. He took another step back, his fingers twitching at his side. His mind screamed at him to pull himself together, to regain control, but he couldn't shake the weight pressing down on his chest. Dr. Taylor watched the exchange closely. He had been around enough emergencies to know when something deeper was at play. He glanced at the patient, their face pale, barely able to keep their eyes open, yet somehow still focused on Bradley. This wasn't just recognition, it was something heavier, something unspoken. "Officer," Dr. Taylor said, his voice calmer now, but no less firm. "We are leaving. If you have something to say it now, or get out of the way." Bradley's throat tightened. His world was closing in around him, every choice suddenly feeling impossible. The weight of his past, the weight of his actions, it all crashed into him at once. He looked at the patient again, really looked at them, and the memory hit like a punch to the gut. Years ago, a different city, a different night, but the same eyes staring back at him. The paramedic, growing increasingly tense, gripped the steering wheel. "This isn't a debate. We are leaving." The tires rolled forward an inch. "Either get in or step aside." Bradley's heart pounded. His fingers hovered near his radio, the static humming softly, waiting for him to make a decision. If he let them go, this moment would define him. If he stopped them, he wasn't sure he could live with what happened next. Dr. Taylor's voice cut through the tension. "You're afraid, aren't you?" His gaze didn't waver. "Afraid of what happens when this patient makes it to the hospital, afraid of what they might say." The words struck deep, but Bradley said nothing. He just stood there, the weight of his past pressing in from all sides, knowing that no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. The air inside the ambulance felt heavy, thick with tension that refused to break. Bradley's jaw tightened as Dr. Taylor's words echoed in his mind. Afraid. He wanted to deny it, to fight back, but the truth had already wrapped around him like a vice. Before he could say anything, the patient shifted slightly, struggling against the pain that held them down. Their fingers twitched, reaching weakly toward Bradley. Then, Barely above a whisper, the words came. "You don't even remember me, do you?" He opened his mouth to respond, to explain himself, but the man across from him didn't seem interested in hearing excuses. Instead, he slid a thin folder across the desk. The officer hesitated before reaching for it. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it open. What he saw made his stomach drop. Inside were documents, timestamps, and security footage he hadn't even realized existed. Angles from street cameras, dashboard recordings, even snippets from bystanders' phones. It wasn't just the moment he pulled the woman over. It was everything. His approach, his words, his body language. Every decision, every second of that stop had been caught from multiple angles, and now it was all laid out in front of him like a case file. His case file. He looked up, his mouth dry. The man cut him off. "There's more." The officer barely had time to process before another piece of paper was placed in front of him. A printed news article. The headline was brutal. Asterisk, racial profiling or abuse of power. Controversial traffic stop under investigation. Asterisk. His chest tightened. How had this gotten out so fast? He had barely left the scene an hour ago. Yet here it was, already making headlines, already spiraling out of his control. The commanding officer exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "This is going national," he muttered under his breath. The man across the desk, however, wasn't done. "You should be asking yourself one question right now," he said, his voice sharp and deliberate. "Why was she even there in the first place?" The officer blinked, thrown off. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward. "Do you really think the mother of the CIA director just happened to be in that neighborhood, at that time, alone?" His eyes locked onto the officer's. "Or do you think there's something bigger going on?" The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a bad traffic stop. It wasn't just about him. It was about something else, something he hadn't even considered. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he realized he might not be the one in the most trouble. The officer's breath hitched as the weight of the man's words settled over him. This wasn't just about what he had done. There was something bigger at play, something he hadn't even considered. His mind raced, trying to piece it together. Why was she there? Why alone? Why now? Before he could speak, the door behind him creaked open. A different officer stepped in, holding a phone. He looked uneasy. "Sir, you need to take this," he said, handing it to the man across the desk. A long pause. The man took the call, listening intently. His face remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted. "Understood," he finally said, then set the phone down. He studied the officer in front of him, as if seeing him differently now. "You got lucky," he finally said. "Very lucky." The officer swallowed hard. What does that mean?" The man exhaled, pushing the folder aside. "She was there for a reason, but not for you." He let the words sink in before continuing. "The woman you detained, she wasn't running errands. She was meeting someone important." The officer's heart pounded. "Who?" The man leaned back, tapping his fingers on the desk. "An informant." The word sent a chill down the officer's spine. "She was gathering intel for her son," the man continued. "Classified intel. Something big. Bigger than you, bigger than this department." He let the weight of it settle. "And because of you, that meeting never happened." The officer's stomach turned. The implications were staggering. He had unknowingly disrupted something far more dangerous than a routine stop. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smirked. "That depends," he said, "because now you're part of this whether you want to be or not." The officer's breath caught in his throat. And just like that, the story he thought was over had only just begun. The officer sat there, his world spinning in ways he never could have imagined. He had started the day thinking he was in control, just another shift, just another stop. But now he was tangled in something far beyond his pay grade, something he wasn't even supposed to know about. The man across from him let the silence stretch, watching him closely, as if waiting for him to process the full weight of what had just been revealed. The officer finally swallowed hard. "So, what happens to me?" he asked. The man tapped his fingers against the desk. "Officially, you'll be under review for misconduct. Unofficially," he paused, letting the word linger, "you keep your mouth shut about what you just learned." The officer exhaled, unsure if that was a warning or a lifeline. Probably both. He had expected to be fired, maybe even arrested. Instead, he was being given a choice: walk away quietly and pretend this never happened, or push back and risk stepping deeper into something he didn't understand. Outside the station, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. The news was already running the story, twisting it in ways he couldn't control. People were calling for consequences, for accountability. His career was on the edge, his name under a spotlight he never wanted. But there was something else too, something that gnawed at him. The woman. She had looked at him that day like she knew this would happen, like she had been expecting it. And maybe she had. Maybe he had never been in control at all. Days later, as he packed up his things from his desk, he found an envelope tucked into his locker. No return address, no name, just a single note inside. *, wrong place, wrong time. Next time, be smarter. *. His hands went cold. He glanced around the station, but no one was watching him. At least, not openly. He folded the note, tucked it into his pocket, and walked out, knowing this chapter of his life was closing. But deep down, he had a feeling the story wasn't over yet.